I thought buying my dream house with the perfect backyard pool was the start of my happy ending. Instead, it became the beginning of a nightmare starring Linda Patterson, the HOA president who wore her authority like armor and treated community rules like gospel. She wanted me to block my pool's view from the street, claiming it violated aesthetic standards. What she didn't know was that my pool wasn't just any pool, it was built on a piece of property that held secrets dating back 40 years. By the time the police arrived that summer afternoon, Linda was about to learn that sometimes the person you're trying to control knows more about property law than you do. Before you watch full story, comment down from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe. The whole mess started 3 weeks after I moved into 1247 Maple Grove Drive. I'd saved for 8 years to afford a house in Willowbrook Estates, a planned community in suburban Phoenix known for its manicured lawns and family-friendly atmosphere. The previous owners had built a stunning kidney-shaped pool with a waterfall feature that sparkled in the Arizona sun. From my living room window, I could see families walking by on evening strolls, kids pressing their faces against my fence to get a better look at the pool. That's when I first encountered Linda Patterson. I was floating on a pool chair, enjoying my second weekend in the new house, when I heard the sharp click of heels on concrete. A woman in her late 50s appeared at my gate, wearing a navy blue blazer despite the 105-degree heat. Her silver hair was pulled back in a tight bun, and she carried a leather portfolio that looked thick enough to be a legal brief. "Excuse me," she called out in a voice that carried the authority of someone used to being obeyed. "Are you the new homeowner?" I paddled over to the pool edge, water dripping from my swim shorts. "That's me. Jake Morrison. Just moved in last month." Linda Patterson, Willowbrook HOA president. She didn't offer a handshake, instead pulling out a clipboard from her portfolio. "We need to discuss your pool situation immediately." I climbed out of the pool, grabbing a towel. "Pool situation? Is something wrong?" Linda's expression suggested everything was wrong. "Mr. Morrison, your pool creates a significant aesthetic disruption for our community. The water reflection is visible from the street, the pool equipment is clearly seen from neighboring properties, and the overall display violates our community's visual harmony standards." I looked around, confused. The pool was in my backyard, behind a 6-foot privacy fence. You could only see it if you deliberately looked through the gaps or stood on your tiptoes. "I'm not sure I understand the problem," I said, trying to keep my voice friendly. "The pool came with the house. The previous owners lived here for 12 years. Linda's clipboard came out and she began writing furiously. "The previous owners received multiple warnings about pool compliance issues. Since you're the new owner, we expect immediate correction of these violations." She handed me a thick packet of papers. Community Covenant 847B requires all recreational water features to be screened from public view. You have 30 days to install appropriate privacy barriers or face daily fines starting at $100. I flipped through the packet, trying to make sense of the dense legal language. Privacy barriers? The pool already has a fence around it. Visual screening, Mr. Morrison. Your current fencing allows gaps that permit neighborhood visibility. You need solid barrier screening to completely block any view of the pool from public areas. The practical implications hit me immediately. Solid screening would turn my beautiful backyard into a windowless box. The pool would lose its connection to the rest of the yard, and the space would feel cramped and enclosed. "This seems excessive," I said carefully. "Can we discuss alternative solutions that might meet the community standards without completely blocking the pool?" Linda's response was swift and non-negotiable. "Mr. Morrison, I've been HOA president for 8 years. I understand these regulations better than anyone. Visual harmony isn't negotiable, it's what maintains our property values and community reputation." She tapped her pen against the clipboard with sharp, deliberate clicks. "Compliance is due within 30 days. Extensions are not granted for aesthetic violations." After she left, I spent the evening reading through the community covenants, trying to understand what I'd gotten myself into. The regulations were incredibly detailed, covering everything from acceptable mailbox colors to precise specifications for holiday decorations. What struck me most was how many rules seemed designed to give the HOA maximum control over residents' private property. But something bothered me about Linda's confidence. The previous owners had lived here for 12 years with this same pool. If there had been ongoing violations, why hadn't they been forced to comply? And why were the violations only becoming an issue now, weeks after I'd moved in? I decided to visit my next-door neighbor, hoping to get some perspective on the situation. Margaret Chin answered the door with flower-covered hands and a warm smile. She was in her 70s, had lived in Willowbrook for over 20 years, and immediately invited me in for coffee and homemade cookies. "Oh, you bought the Morrison place," she said, settling into her kitchen chair. "We were so sorry to see Tom and Betty move to Florida. They were wonderful neighbors." "The HOA president says there were ongoing issues with the pool," I said, testing the waters. "Multiple warnings about compliance problems?" Margaret's expression shifted from friendly to confused. "Pool problems? Tom and Betty never mentioned any pool issues. Linda Patterson has only been making noise about pools in the past year or so, after her own pool renovation went over budget." This was interesting. Her own pool renovation? "Oh yes," Margaret said, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "Linda spent $80,000 last year renovating her backyard pool area. Huge disappointment. The contractor made some mistakes and the final result didn't match her expectations. She was furious about the money she'd lost." Margaret leaned forward. "That's when she started this campaign about pool aesthetic standards. I think she's trying to force everyone else to modify their pools so hers doesn't look so bad by comparison." The picture was becoming clearer. This wasn't about community standards, it was about Linda's personal disappointment with her own pool renovation. "Has anyone else been forced to install screening?" I asked. "3 families so far," Margaret said. "The Johnsons spent $15,000 on privacy barriers last month. The Rodriguezes are fighting the citations in small claims court. And the Washingtons just filled in their pool entirely rather than deal with the hassle." I felt my stomach drop. Linda wasn't just targeting me, she was systematically going after every pool owner in the community. "Is there any way to challenge these rules?" I asked. Margaret sighed. "Honey, Linda knows HOA law inside and out. She's got lawyers, documentation, and 8 years of experience forcing compliance. Most people just give up and pay whatever she demands." That night, I started researching HOA regulations and homeowner rights online. What I found was both encouraging and frustrating. HOAs did have significant power, but that power wasn't unlimited. Property owners had rights too, especially when it came to pre-existing conditions and selective enforcement. More importantly, I discovered that Arizona had specific laws about HOA rule changes and retroactive enforcement. Any new community standards had to be applied fairly to all residents, and homeowners had to be given reasonable notice and opportunity to comply. I decided to attend the next monthly HOA board meeting to understand Linda's authority and see if there were other residents facing similar issues. The meeting was held in the community center, a bland conference room with fluorescent lighting and uncomfortable folding chairs. About 20 residents attended, mostly older homeowners who seemed to know each other well. Linda sat at the front table with 4 other board members, presiding over the meeting with the efficiency of a corporate executive. When she opened the floor for resident concerns, I stood up and politely introduced myself as the new owner on Maple Grove Drive. I explained my situation with the pool screening requirements and asked whether there might be alternative compliance options that would meet community standards without requiring major renovations. Linda's response was immediate and thorough. She pulled out a folder of photographs showing my pool from various angles, including shots taken from the street, neighboring yards, and even what appeared to be aerial photos taken from a second-story window. "Mr. Morrison," she said, spreading the photos across the table for everyone to see, "your pool creates significant visual disruption for our entire community. These images clearly show water reflection visible from public areas, pool equipment exposed to neighboring properties, and recreational activities that generate noise and distraction." She gestured to the photos like a prosecutor presenting evidence. Community Covenant 847B exists to maintain the aesthetic harmony that protects all our property values. Selective enforcement or special exceptions would undermine the standards that make Willowbrook Estates a desirable place to live. Several residents nodded in agreement, and I felt like a student being lectured in front of the entire class. Linda had clearly prepared for this moment, anticipating my arguments and marshalling evidence to support her position. "I understand the community standards," I said, trying to keep my voice respectful. "But I'm hoping we can find a solution that meets those standards without requiring me to completely enclose my backyard." "Mr. Morrison," Linda said, her voice taking on the patient tone teachers use with slow students, "compliance isn't negotiable. You have 3 weeks remaining to install appropriate screening. Extensions are not available for aesthetic violations." After the meeting, a younger woman approached me in the parking lot. She introduced herself as Sarah Kim, a real estate attorney who lived in one of the newer sections of Willowbrook. "That was brutal," she said quietly. "Linda's been getting more aggressive about pool enforcement lately. I think she's trying to establish precedents before someone challenges her authority." Sarah explained that several residents had come to her privately asking about HOA legal limits, but most were too intimidated to take action against Linda directly. The thing is, Sarah said, Linda's interpretation of the covenants is pretty aggressive. Some of her enforcement actions might not hold up under legal scrutiny, but she's counting on people not wanting to fight. What would it take to challenge her? I asked. Documentation, legal research, and the willingness to potentially go to court, Sarah said. It's expensive and time-consuming, which is why most people just comply. As I drove home that night, I felt the weight of the decision ahead of me. I could spend $15,000 to install pool screening and avoid the confrontation, or I could fight Linda's demands and risk escalating legal costs with no guarantee of success. But something Margaret Chen had said kept bothering me. The previous owners had lived here for 12 years without any pool compliance issues. If these were legitimate community standards, why had they never been enforced until now? I decided to do some detective work. The next morning, I visited the county clerk's office to research the property history and HOA covenant records. What I found was more interesting than I'd expected. The original Willowbrook Estates covenants, filed in 1987, contained basic guidelines about property maintenance and architectural approval for major modifications. The pool-related restrictions Linda had cited were part of Amendment 847, which had been added to the covenants in last year. Amendment 847 had been adopted by the HOA board in March, just 2 months after Linda's pool renovation disaster. The amendment specifically targeted recreational water features and required visual screening to maintain community aesthetic harmony. But here's what was really interesting. According to Arizona HOA law, covenant amendments that impose new restrictions on existing property features require a community-wide vote, not just board approval. And homeowners with pre-existing features that would be affected by new restrictions have to be individually notified and given opportunity to request variances. I found no record of a community vote on Amendment 847. I found no record of individual notices to pool owners. And I found no record of any variance request process. Linda had essentially created new rules targeting existing pools and was enforcing them as if they'd always been part of the community covenants. Armed with this information, I contacted Sarah Kim and asked if she'd be willing to review my research. We met at a coffee shop away from Willowbrook, and Sarah's expression grew more excited as she examined the documents. "Jake, this is huge," she said, spreading the papers across our table. "If Amendment 847 was adopted improperly, then Linda has no legal authority to enforce these pool restrictions." Sarah explained that HOA covenant amendments in Arizona required specific procedures to be valid: community notice, homeowner voting, and grandfather protections for existing property features. Linda had skipped all these requirements. More importantly, Sarah said, if Linda knows the amendment was adopted improperly and she's still using it to threaten fines, that could be considered harassment or abuse of HOA authority. We spent 2 hours developing a strategy. First, I would formally request all documentation related to Amendment 847's adoption process. Second, I would demand an immediate halt to enforcement actions pending proper legal review. Third, if Linda refused to cooperate, we would file a complaint with the Arizona Department of Real Estate, which oversees HOA compliance. That afternoon, I sent Linda a certified letter requesting copies of all community notices, voting records, and variance procedures related to Amendment 847. I also informed her that I would not be installing pool screening until the legal authority for such requirements had been properly established. Linda's response came within 24 hours. She called me at 7 a.m., her voice tight with anger. "Mr. Morrison, your letter is completely inappropriate. I don't have time to educate you about HOA legal procedures, and I won't be intimidated by threats of legal action." "Linda, I'm not making threats," I said calmly. "I'm asking for documentation to understand the legal basis for these requirements. That's my right as a homeowner." "Your rights are defined by our community covenants," she snapped. "You have 2 weeks to comply with pool screening requirements or face daily fines. This conversation is over." She hung up, but I could hear uncertainty in her voice for the first time since I'd met her. Linda was used to intimidating people into compliance, not answering questions about her authority. The next morning, I found a new citation taped to my front door. This time, Linda had cited me for excessive pool usage during community quiet hours and recreational noise violations affecting neighboring properties. The citation was dated at 6:30 p.m. the previous evening, when I'd been swimming laps for about 20 minutes. Quiet hours, according to the community guidelines, didn't start until 10 p.m. And I'd been swimming silently, no music, no splashing, just gentle laps back and forth. This was clearly retaliation for my legal questions, and it gave me exactly the evidence I needed to demonstrate harassment. I called Sarah Kim immediately. "She's escalating because she's worried," Sarah said after I read her the citation. False citations for normal pool use could be considered abuse of process, especially when they're obviously retaliatory. What's our next move? Document everything and keep using your pool normally. If she continues issuing bogus citations, we'll have a pattern of harassment to present to the state regulatory board. Over the next week, Linda issued 3 more citations for increasingly ridiculous violations: pool equipment noise during residential hours, my pool filter running during the day, excessive water reflection creating neighborhood distraction, sunlight bouncing off the water, and recreational activities inconsistent with community character, me floating on a pool chair while reading a book. Each citation came with a $100 fine and a hand-delivered lecture from Linda about community standards and my failure to respect established procedures. What Linda didn't know was that I was recording these interactions on my phone and documenting each citation with photos and timestamps. Her increasing desperation was creating a comprehensive record of HOA authority abuse. The breaking point came 2 weeks later, on a Saturday afternoon when Linda showed up at my door with Frank Weber, the HOA treasurer, and someone she introduced as the community's legal advisor. "Mr. Morrison," Linda announced formally, "your continued non-compliance with community standards has forced us to take more serious action. Effective immediately, we are placing a lien on your property for unpaid fines totaling $1,400. She handed me an official-looking document declaring that my failure to install pool screening and my ongoing violations of community noise standards had resulted in a legal claim against my property. Furthermore," Linda continued, "we are issuing a formal cease and desist order requiring you to stop all pool usage until compliance issues are resolved." The legal advisor, a nervous-looking man in an ill-fitting suit, nodded seriously as Linda spoke, but I noticed he avoided making eye contact with me. "Linda," I said calmly, "I need to ask you a direct question. Do you have documentation showing that Amendment 847 was properly adopted according to Arizona HOA law?" For the first time since I'd known her, Linda hesitated. She glanced at the legal advisor, who suddenly seemed very interested in his shoes. "Mr. Morrison, the validity of our community covenants is not subject to resident review," she said, but her voice had lost its usual certainty. "Actually it is," I replied. Arizona Revised Statutes Section 33 to 1804 gives homeowners the right to review all documentation related to covenant amendments that affect their property. The legal advisor looked up sharply and I saw recognition in his eyes. He knew I was right. "Linda," he said quietly, "perhaps we should discuss this matter further before proceeding with enforcement actions." But Linda wasn't backing down. "Mr. Morrison, you have 48 hours to cease all pool usage and begin installation of required screening. Non-compliance will result in additional fines and potential legal action." As they left, I heard the legal advisor whispering urgently to Linda, but she was shaking her head dismissively. That evening I called Sarah Kim with an update. "She's cornered herself," Sarah said after I described the lien threat. "Filing a property lien based on invalid covenant enforcement could be considered fraudulent legal process. That's a serious offense. What do we do now?" "We call the police." The next morning, Sarah and I met with Detective Rodriguez at the Phoenix Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit. Detective Rodriguez specialized in real estate fraud and HOA abuse cases, and she was very interested in our documentation. "This looks like a pattern of harassment using fabricated legal authority," she said after reviewing our evidence. "Property liens based on invalid HOA enforcement can be considered criminal fraud, especially when there's evidence of intentional deception." Detective Rodriguez explained that Arizona had been cracking down on HOA abuse after several high-profile cases of board members using fake regulations to harass homeowners or enrich themselves through excessive fines. "We'll need to investigate the Amendment 847 adoption process," she said, "but if your research is accurate, Ms. Patterson could be facing charges for abuse of fiduciary duty and fraudulent legal process." 3 days later, Detective Rodriguez called to inform me that her investigation had confirmed my findings. Amendment 847 had never been properly adopted according to state law, meaning Linda had been enforcing non-existent regulations for over a year. "We're issuing arrest warrants for Ms. Patterson and her legal advisor," Detective Rodriguez said. "They'll be charged with HOA fraud and filing false legal documents." That afternoon I was floating in my pool, finally able to relax for the first time in weeks, when I heard sirens approaching. Through my fence, I could see police cars pulling up to Linda's house 3 doors down. 20 minutes later, Detective Rodriguez knocked on my door. "Miss Patterson has been arrested," she informed me. "We also arrested her legal advisor, who turned out to be a disbarred attorney who'd been helping her fabricate legal documents." "What happens now?" "The fraudulent lien against your property will be removed immediately. The HOA will be required to refund all fines paid by residents based on invalid regulations. And Ms. Patterson will be facing criminal charges that could result in jail time and restitution payments." Detective Rodriguez smiled. "Your documentation made this case incredibly easy to prove. Most HOA fraud victims don't have this level of evidence." The aftermath was swift and satisfying. Linda was convicted of HOA fraud and sentenced to 6 months in county jail plus 3 years probation. She was also ordered to pay $47,000 in restitution to homeowners who'd been fined under her fabricated regulations. The disbarred attorney received 2 years in prison for filing false legal documents and conspiracy to commit fraud. The HOA held emergency elections to replace Linda and the board members who'd supported her enforcement campaign. The new board immediately rescinded all pool-related citations and established new procedures requiring legal review before any covenant amendments could be adopted. But the most satisfying moment came 6 months later, when Linda was released from jail and had to sell her house to pay the restitution orders. The new owners removed all the expensive privacy screening she'd installed around her own pool, opening up the backyard and creating exactly the kind of open, welcoming space she tried to force the rest of us to eliminate. As I write this, I'm sitting by my pool, watching my neighbor's kids press their faces against the fence to admire the water. The late afternoon sun creates beautiful reflections that dance across the water's surface, and the gentle hum of the pool filter provides a peaceful soundtrack to summer evenings. I learned that standing up to bullies isn't just about protecting yourself, it's about protecting everyone who comes after you. Linda's fake regulations had already forced 3 families to spend thousands of dollars on unnecessary modifications. Her arrest prevented dozens of other homeowners from facing the same harassment. The experience also taught me something important about community leadership. Real authority comes from serving residents' interests, not from controlling their private property for personal satisfaction. Linda's downfall wasn't just about legal technicalities, it was about the difference between leadership and authoritarianism. Sometimes the best way to deal with someone who abuses their power is simply to demand that they prove they actually have that power in the first place. In Linda's case, she'd been counting on intimidation and fake authority for so long that she'd forgotten to establish real authority. My pool is still here, still reflecting sunlight, still providing joy for my family and entertainment for the neighborhood kids who peek through the fence. And every time I see those reflections dancing on the water, I'm reminded that some things are worth fighting for, especially when the fight protects not just your own rights, but the rights of everyone in your community. The most important lesson? When someone claims to have authority over your property, don't just comply, ask them to prove it. You might be surprised by what you discover when you start asking the right questions.